At Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health, we strive every day to deliver results you can see in your animal's productivity and your bottom line. From a smooth transition into the milking string for your fresh cows, to a happy welcome home from your furry friend. From a strong start in your poultry flock, to consistent weight gains for your finishing hogs. We expect to earn your business and your trust with our people, our products, and our science. Our people have an intense passion for your animals and your success. You can count on us for honest, candid advice and practical solutions for your toughest challenges. As the global leader in choline production, chelation, and encapsulation technology, we take our obligation to you and to the environment seriously. Our products are backed by the most extensive and thorough research portfolio, while our business is committed to advancing environmental sustainability and animal welfare. In the end, it all comes down to results. Balchem delivers real results you can count on, results that exceed your expectations, and results that bring true value to your bottom line. Leading the charge to meet the nutritional needs of ruminants, monogastrics, and companion animals, Balchem offers a growing portfolio of nutritional products and a dedication to innovation and industry sustainability. Balchem is here to solve today and shape tomorrow. As the global leader in choline, Balchem has spent more than 50 years perfecting the art and science of choline chloride production. The new Puricol line delivers the highest standards of quality, produced in state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, and backed by the strictest process controls for a level of purity, safety, and consistency you can't find anywhere else. Turn to Puricol choline chloride from Balchem for an unmatched level of quality you can trust. Visit balchemanh.com to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem. And as we close out 2021 and leave behind all the challenges that came along with the year, we can look forward to a fresh new start in 2022. But what will the year look like for agriculture? In today's Real Science webinar titled 2022 and the Global Commodity Supercycle, we will look to our expert, Brett Stuart, co-founder of Global AgriTrends, to give us an idea of how 2022 will unfold. But before we get started, let's go through a few housekeeping items. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you're having any audio issues, please reach out via the questions box and we can give you more specific instructions on how to troubleshoot the problems. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions to Mr. Stuart by typing them into the questions pane on the control panel. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. There are several handouts available during today's session, including a copy of the slides and a participation certificate to claim your ARPAS CEU credits. Both are available in the Handouts tab on the control panel. These resources will also be available following the webinar at balchem.com/realscience. I'd now like to introduce Brett Stuart. Brett is a founder and the president of Global AgriTrends. The firm was organized in 2006 and provides global market research, analysis, and forecasting to a variety of clients around the world. He was formerly the lead economist for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. He has conducted numerous research analysis projects in the global meat trade arena, as well as advising government representatives on international trade. Mr. Stuart has conducted on-the-ground agricultural research for a variety of clients on 6 continents. Brett was raised on a cattle ranch operating in Utah and Wyoming and has previously worked as a controller in the ag industry. He received an undergraduate degree in accounting at Utah State University and a master's of business administration from the University of Nebraska. Brett, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. It's great to be with you all today. It's that time of year when we sit and kind of reflect back on the year and start thinking about what is 2022 going to hold. And if I rewind, Scott, and go back to 1 year ago, we were sitting here, and that was the COVID year, right? 2020, December 2020, we went through COVID. But the great news in December 2020 was we have vaccine candidates, and not just one, we've got multiple vaccines. These are going to roll out, and it is going to drive a stake through the heart of COVID. COVID's going to end, and 2021 is going to be much more normal. At least that's how I took it. And 2021 has been anything but normal. And COVID has evolved from the pandemic fears to vaccine rate rollout to inflation to stimulus to all these other things. And really, COVID has probably had a bigger impact on 2021 than it did on 2020 from the commodity standpoint. And so I want to talk about that as we flip the calendar and look into 2022. That's kind of my goal, is to try and just really outline where we sit now and what that means for next year. So here's my outline. We're going to start with the world's largest macroeconomic experiment. Talk about external drivers, China, COVID, some other risks. And then I've just got a couple slides at the end of a 10-year outlook. So what is the world's largest macroeconomic experiment? And this is my, my most academic view of it I can give you, is a political cartoon. So you can see there the firebomber flying over to put out the wildfire being COVID and the firebomber being the US Congress. And the voice out of the cockpit says, "That strange looking fire retardant." And the response is, "It's money." And this is technically what happened, is for the first time really in history, our government shelled out money in a way that we've never seen before. And it was really done to try and stem the pandemic. And that money flow has completely changed our economy and will for years to come. I would guess that 20 years from now in Econ 101 class, they're going to be looking back at 2021 and saying, was that a good idea or not a good idea? What the US government did when they expanded the US money supply by 40%. 40% in 2 years. Now, it has an effect on everything when we do this. We put $6 trillion into circulation, and it's not over yet. The Federal Reserve is still purchasing $250 billion a month in bonds. That money is being pushed out into banks. Money is being poured on the banks. The banks don't know what to do with it. They're begging people to take it. Interest rates are low. Everyone has cash. Nobody wants it. I've talked to a few bank boards in the last month, and it's a major concern. Some of them are saying, we want our customers to take their money. We're tired of huge deposits. Those don't help us. They don't make us anything now. And so we're in this situation where the money supply is phenomenal. But what has it done to commodities? The global stimulus has now reached 10 trillion US dollars. 6 trillion of that was the US, and there's more coming. And that was 10 trillion was announced within 4 months of the pandemic. But you put all this money into circulation in the US economy, and all of a sudden everybody is out shopping, spending money, right? Consumers do what we do. You give us $1,000, we go sign a $5,000 loan or a $50,000 loan. And so not only the money supply, you think of the compounded debt as people accrue debt, and everyone's equity has increased, so debt's even easier to sign on to. That overloads the supply chains. We have the West Coast port issues. We've had sick workers here and there not show up for work. So all of these things compound, and pretty soon we have major problems. Right now, where we're sitting today, we've got soaring labor costs. We've got labor shortages everywhere. Soaring fuel costs, electricity costs, fertilizer costs, glyphosate, that's Roundup for our Roundup Ready commodities. Everything is in tight supply and expensive, and it's a little bit unsettling. When does this end? I would say look further than you think, and I'll tell you why here in just a minute. How does it end? Soft or hard landing? Barring some big shock, if we had some serious terrorist attack or something significant like that, it could end more abruptly. But barring that, it's not going to be a rapid end. It's going to stay with us. Now, inflation will end this year. We're going to take inflation way down this year. Now, think about what I'm telling you here. We only measure inflation on a 12-month basis. So when diesel prices hit $4.20 a gallon, that was a 45% annual increase. 12 months from now, or 12 months from that point, when diesel is still $4.20 a gallon, it's going to be a 0% inflation. So the inflation deniers that said, well, it's transitory, it's not going to be a big deal, they're going to be proven right, because this year, all those inflation indexes are going to come back towards zero. The reality is the prices are still going to be as high as they were, because we only measure it on a 12-month calendar basis. So if we look at what this has done in the commodity world, there you can see this is global food indices from the United Nations. Veg oils, that's lit the chart, and it always does. I can go back to previous cycles, and veg oil always takes off first and goes the furthest. Meat is the laggard. You can see how slow it was to get the meat prices to go up, but they are up sharply. Now this is global, this isn't US. US would show a much higher increase in meat prices. And the only reason the meat price dips on here is because Chinese hogs have dropped by 60% since January. And that is because of oversupply from African swine fever profits. And so that weight of the Chinese hogs on the global meat price is noted here. But if you ignore the Chinese hog situation, the meat prices are very high. Now, if we go back to August 2020, so I'm looking here at about a 15-month inflation, you can see steer price up 30%, hog price up 44%. Normally, that would be fantastic. We would love to have cattle and hog prices up 30, 40%. But the problem is diesel 54, corn up 85, fertilizer 110, natural gas 166, steel 280%. So everything that every producer goes to the store and buys now has went up faster than his revenue has. So even though those are good price moves, they're not enough. And we're definitely putting pressure on the farm sector this year. Now the bankers look at the farm sector and say, oh no, the farm sector's in fantastic shape, because bankers look at equity and borrowing. And they say, oh, for the amount of loan they have, their farm is worth far more because the land values went up so fast. Well, that looks great on paper, but if you're a farmer or rancher, you realize, well, that's not cash. That's not cash flow. My ranch can be worth 10 million versus 1 million, and it doesn't really change how I pay my bills every day. And so from one standpoint, you'll hear, oh, the farm sector's in great shape. From a cash flow standpoint, it's not so great. And this inflation, like I said, is going to continue. We just look at corn price, and there's a lot of debate about what corn prices are going to do in 2022. Take a look at this. We've seen the US and Brazilian prices drop fairly significantly from the summer peak. But look at China. Chinese corn prices are still near $11 a bushel. Now they claim they harvested a record crop this fall, but they're still importing and their prices aren't going down. And they've liquidated a bunch of hogs over the last 6 months. And so even with fewer hogs and a supposed record crop, they're aggressively buying in the international markets and their corn price is not going down. I would question whether China has as much corn as they say they have. And so when you think about crop price, follow the China price. Put more weight on it than you do on Brazil and US, because last year they bought 26 million tons of corn. Before that, they were buying about 3 million tons a year. So if China steps out and buys another 26, 28 million tons this year, that's going to have a major impact on the global corn markets. So in terms of US consumers, cash is everywhere. There's 4 times the balance in checking accounts than there was pre-COVID. Consumers are flush with cash, but look at this. 65% of all the cash in checking accounts is held by the wealthiest 10%. This has been really good for the wealthiest 10%. It hasn't been quite as good, but it is better for the lower income brackets. But still, people say, when does this end? And I say, the party doesn't end until the money runs out. We still have 4 times the cash in the bank that we had before COVID. So the money has not run out yet. So consumers should be ecstatic, right? And I think they were for the first few months when those stimulus checks came out and everybody went and bought new cars and spent money. But now I think people are starting to realize, wait a minute, my housing cost is going through the roof. My fuel cost, my food cost, everything is going up. And all of a sudden it doesn't feel as fun as it felt getting those initial stimulus checks. The index of US consumer sentiment put out by the University of Michigan showed a November number at a 10-year low. So I just showed you consumers are flush with cash. Everyone has money, far more money than we had before the pandemic. Yet consumer sentiment has tanked. 1 in 4 cited inflationary reductions in their living standards, 25%, mainly the elderly and lower income groups. Half of all families surveyed in this anticipate that their inflation adjusted income will be reduced next year. If we consider how fast inflation's going, are you going to make more money or less money next year? Half of the surveyed said less. Homes, vehicles, durables were quoted more frequently than any time in 50 years on that survey. So consumers are very well aware of inflation. They may not have been 6 months ago, now they're feeling it. So that has an impact as we think about the strong demand that's driven beef prices so high and the strong consumer demand. Consumers are nervous. They're starting to get a little nervous about it. In the midst of all this, the Fed chairman, Chairman Powell, came out and says, wait a minute, we were wrong. Now, all year I've been openly mocking the Fed chairman for saying that inflation is temporary. He's the one that said it's transitory and it's not a big deal, and he's way more worried about employment than he is about inflation. Within a couple weeks of him being reconfirmed as the Fed chairman, he came out and said, wait a minute, we were wrong. It's time to retire the word transitory. Inflation's real, and we've got to start tapering bond purchases much faster, and we may raise interest rates next month or next year. And I hate to say there's politics involved, but when that happens right after he was reconfirmed for another term, it feels a little political. Now, in the past, what we've done, and people remember, some don't remember, but people point to the 1970s and 80s as the last time we saw big inflation. Let's take a look at what happened then. The red line here is the federal funds effective interest rate. So the red line is interest rate, the blue line is inflation. So it started in the early 70s. If you go to the far left-hand side of that chart, you see inflation run, and boy, the Fed was on top of it. The second that inflation went up, the interest rate went up. And they both ran, inflation went up, interest rates went up with it, to the point it ended up driving a recession. That gray area is a recession in 1974. But the interest rates were taken up to 12.5% and broke that inflation. Then we get into the late 70s, and there was the oil embargo. There were a lot of things going on here. But again, inflation runs up. Inflation gets up above 12.5%. That time you can see the Fed was a little slower to raise rates, and they ended up taking rates clear up to 18%. The federal rate went to 18% to break that inflation, and it ended up causing 2 recessions. Now we look at where we are today. The textbook answer is, if you want to cure inflation, start raising interest rates. What's the problem with that? Our debt level is absolutely overwhelming. And in the past, it used to be the Chinese was holding our debt, and they still hold some debt in Japan. But the biggest purchaser of our bonds now is the Federal Reserve. We have the Treasury selling bonds to the Federal Reserve rather than selling them overseas. So we're basically, it's an intercompany transaction. It almost feels like someone's cheating at Monopoly here. We're selling our own bonds to ourselves. And now we have that enormous debt that we could not afford to pay were we to raise rates. And so, yeah, I think we'll see a 1/4 point raise, maybe even in the first quarter of next year. We may see a 1/2 point by mid-year. I don't think that's going to wreck things. That may damper the housing market a little bit, but our ability to say we're going to charge this thing up to 6%, 8%, 10% rates, we no longer have that ability. And that's why I say inflation could run hotter and longer than a lot of people realize. We just don't have this bullet in our gun this time. So what happens if we have persistent inflation? Well, the risk is that inflation turns to stagflation, and that just means inflation with a slow economy. That's a terrible scenario, and we've been through it before, but I think that's ahead of us. As people get nervous, if we have to raise rates, as the money runs out, this economy is going to slow down, and we're still going to have this persistent inflation. And so that causes a lower standard of living in the US, in the developed world, but what it causes is instability in the third world. And just Google, we don't see a lot of this without looking for it. Google global food inflation, Google Brazil inflation. Go look at what's happening in Nigeria. Those central banks in Africa have been raising rates all year long, trying to stifle inflation. They don't have the weight to do it. They can raise their rates, but they're still getting clobbered by inflation. And so think about the Arab Spring, 2010. I remember I was in North Africa when that was going on, and governments toppled. Egypt turned over, Tunisia turned over, Morocco turned over. You know, angry people will protest the government, but hungry people will take over the government. And we're in a situation now where the world's poor are in a real dire spot because of this very fast commodity inflation. So some of the external market drivers, let's talk about COVID, China, other risks. So we've got the Omicron variant. The WHO says it's highly divergent variant, number of mutations, higher transmissibility. They suggested it poses a very high global risk and suggested severe consequences. The reality is we just don't know yet. It's only been about 2 weeks that this variant's really been out there. By week 3, we should know a lot more about transmissibility, about virulence, and about the existing vaccine protection. We're starting to hear bits and pieces of that, but that's the real question now is what does this do? And like I say, I think within a week or 2, we're going to know a lot more. If we look at the death rate, and this is by country, it's Germany, the US, UK, Mexico, France, and Canada. You can see the big waves. March to May 2020, that was the first wave. November to March, it was over the holidays last year, November really into February last year. Right over the holidays, there was a big spike worldwide. This is a death rate again. And then this summer, it changed. It went August to November, so it came much faster in 2021. The question is, we went through this big wave. Do we have a double wave as we go into the holidays this year? And time will tell. Now, there's a lot of discussion on cases, but really the factor that matters at the end of the day is the death rate, because the vaccinated population has a much lower mortality. And so we'll have more cases, but that doesn't have the same economic damage or the same result in restrictions as a death rate. So this is a death rate. Here's the cases. And isn't it kind of interesting that that death rate matches pretty well? We have some big waves. The case count is all over the board. Those are the exact same timelines. And so we'll see where this goes. But again, I would say cases aren't necessarily the problem. And hopefully these variants become less virulent. And hopefully the vaccinated population is better suited to survive this. And we see higher survivability. Worldwide right now, COVID is roughly 99% survivable. So here's the vax rates. And you can see the US there, we're stuck at 59%. And the harder the government's telling everyone they have to do it, the harder people dig in their heels and say, the government isn't telling me I have to get vaccinated. And so we're kind of stuck there. We came out of the gate much faster than these other countries. But look at Japan, 76%. Look at Korea, 78%. Those countries didn't have much vaccine 6 months ago, and they jumped in quick. And so the big economic boost that we've seen in the US as restrictions were pulled off this year may be duplicated in countries like Japan and Korea for 2022 because their vax rates are so much higher. They're not going to have the restrictions in 2022 that they had this year. And so there is the opportunity to see some good global boost around the world because of these higher vax rates. Bottom line, COVID will continue to drive our global markets likely for years. There will be more variants. There will be more money. And that's really the factor, has been that flow of money. All right, let's shift gears. The next big fun topic is China. And we could talk all day about it, but I won't. I just want to flash through a few slides here. But China, as I mentioned, has had African swine fever. 2018, it was found, August 2018. They liquidated 2/3 of the swine herd. Now, China has half the pigs in the world. So when they liquidate 2/3 of the swine herd, it has an effect. The effect was fantastic profits. For 2021 and half of 2020, they were making $300 a head profit because the supplies were so tight. And they did what every global farmer would do. They overproduced, right? High prices fix high prices. They collapsed the market, and that's where they are today. They're oversupplied. The market is still heavily supplied, and they still have the virus. But they've gotten a taste for beef. And that picture at the bottom right, that was my last trip to China before COVID. That was in 2019. Eating beef with some Chinese importers and a South American meat analyst. And we shared a $220 tomahawk ribeye. It was like 4 inches thick. And they just thought it was heaven. But the beef revolution is for real in China. They are loving beef. They just simply cannot get enough. And that's really changing the global landscape for protein. Let me just flip through some commodities, and I want you to look at the red lines on each of these charts. Global corn imports, I mentioned 26 million tons last year. I think they're going to import the same amount this year. Biggest corn importer in the world. Where were they 5 years ago? Not really on the radar. Soybeans, no surprise. China's been the big soybean importer for decades. Wheat. China wasn't really in the wheat markets 3 years ago. Now they're the #3 importer in the world. 2021, they were #2. Global beef, biggest importer in the world by a margin. They've just banned their biggest supplier, Brazil, over inconsistencies in animal disease testing. So Brazil's out, China's still the biggest importer in the world, and prices are going up. Pork. There we go. There's the African swine fever, 5 million tons a year, biggest pork importer in the world. #2 chicken importer in the world. 3 years ago, not on the radar. So you look at these charts and go, okay, I get why China's a big deal. China is going to continue to drive all of our commodity markets. Now we can look back at the phase 1 deal that President Trump negotiated and the big purchase commitments. And he said China's going to buy $37 billion a year. That was the commitment. Well, they haven't reached that. But when you look at what they've done, it's pretty incredible. The phase 1 deal was more than just purchase commitments. It opened the market for beef. It took down some of the sanitary, phytosanitary barriers that we fought with China. So it really opened the market. But China isn't buying $5 billion in October because of Trump's purchase commitment. They're buying it because they need it. And so the phase 1 agreement gave a little bit of a boost, but there isn't a gun to China's head saying you have to keep buying more and more US agriculture. There's no real accountability even for that agreement, especially with the new administration. But look at what that agreement has done. So we didn't hit 37 billion, but we started there about 14 billion in 2019, and we're at 33 today. Now, the reality is this isn't all because of the phase 1. The phase 1 lifted the barriers. This is because China needs food. This is simply market-driven demand. And the US is in a fantastic spot to supply China with corn and wheat and soybeans and meat and chicken and everything else. And so that's going to continue. China's growing middle class is not done yet, and their population's capped. It's pretty flat. But that middle class continues to grow as more peasants move into it. And so that demand is going to continue. If we look at their meat and poultry imports, and this is the world I live in, it's pretty interesting. So before ASF, look back at the very left-hand side of that chart. They used to import about 750 million a month. That was about what they'd import. Today, they're 2.2 billion. So they're 3x. Even on pork, which their pork market's oversupplied, they're still importing 3 times the pork they were importing before ASF. This is not going away. China is going to continue to be a massive global protein market driver. And so there's their pork supplies. You can see the meltdown from ASF. 2021, I've got them increasing, but that's mainly because they've liquidated for most of the year. They've had liquidation going on because of disease issues and because their prices got below the cost of production. So they've liquidated a lot of hogs, which means 2022, they're going to have a shorter supply. But look at the yellow bar, the imports. This was a 1 to 2 million ton market before ASF. Now it's a 4 to 6 million ton market. And 2021, they're actually going to beat my estimate. They're going to be probably about 4.5 million tons this year. And beyond that, who knows? I mean, the volatility is incredible because of the disease issue. It's not resolved, there's no vaccine, and the disease continues in China. So let's run down a few of the other global risks. Drought, labor, fertilizer, climate policy, the Russian troop buildup on the Ukraine border. I've got a slide on each of these just to talk about for a minute. Here's our US Drought Monitor. Now, in the middle of winter, no one really cares too much what the Drought Monitor looks like. It all comes down to, do we get rain in the spring and do we get the moisture when we need it? Now out here, I'm in Idaho, so out here in the Rockies, we need snow because that's what makes our streams run all summer long. And our snowpack is very low right now. We just had our first snowfall of the year last week, and it was about a ½ an inch. But supposedly we're getting some more tonight and tomorrow. But if you look at that key Midwest region, it's a mixed bag, right? Nebraska has some dryness, even out into Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, southern Minnesota. That's really where we're looking when we look at the grain situation. And we won't know right now, but the drought situation is not good. And what it really tells us, it gives us a hint of the global weather patterns. Global weather patterns are important to follow and understand. And what I mean by that, here's a La Nina chart. Now it looks like a tie-dyed t-shirt, but it isn't. The gray area is land, the colored area is ocean. So if you squint for a minute, you can start to see North and South America appear. A La Nina pattern means a cool equator in the Pacific. These are sea surface temperature anomalies. So this is the temperature of the sea surface compared to the average. So that red box in the middle that goes all the way from Indonesia to Ecuador, that is that's the equator. It's cooler, it's blue, right? So that means there's less evaporation happening on the equator right now. That is what fuels the US jet stream. That's how we get moisture. So when that equator is warmer than normal, it's an El Nino, and that lends to excess rain, even flooding in the US. So right now, December 8th, the La Nina pattern continues. Now that gives tons of rain to Australia. Look at all the evaporation around Australia happening. They're getting buried in rain. They're restocking their cow herds so fast, their cattle prices are record high, not enough cattle to slaughter as they restock. But look at the blue water off the west coast of South America. They're going to have drier weather too, at least for the next month or so. Now this can change, and this isn't as important today as it will be in March. If we get to March and that El Nino that La Nina pattern continues, look out, because our drought risk is rising. And so that's one of the indicators we watch to say, what are we headed for next year? It would be unusual to have 2 big drought years in a row, but it just depends on global trade winds and weather patterns. What about labor? This is the issue. As I talk to my clients, I hear over and over and over is labor, labor, labor. Big feedlots, big hog farms, processing plants, those managers, when they wake up in the morning, the first thing on their mind is, are we going to have enough people today to keep the plant running? We added 6.5 million hirings in November. We have 11 million job openings currently in the US. 11 million. That's nearly double what we'd see before COVID. Labor unions are seeing maximum leverage, right? That's unsettling. We've seen the strikes at John Deere, at Kellogg. We nearly had a strike at Canada's biggest beef packing plant. That's definitely a concern. I'm happy to see processors and those in the ag industry raising wages as fast as they can right now, because we've got to keep employees coming. And how do we fix it? That's the question. How is this fixed? And my answer is, it's not a good answer. The answer is get used to it. We're not fixing it. Now, there is an answer, and we have millions of workers south of the border, not just Mexico, but even Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. We could bring millions of workers in, no problem. But I don't see the administration doing that. The administration has shown no appetite to bring in more immigrant workers. And I think their solution to this rapid inflation in all our costs is, Let's keep the labor market as tight as we can so wages go up to keep up with that. But as wages go up, it also raises the cost of everything we buy, right? And so we're in a spot now where we desperately need labor and we just do not have access. I know people working on the H-2A visas, the temporary seasonal agriculture worker visas. They are very tough to get approved. That's why I say there's no good answer here. Fertilizer frenzy. So there's the North American Fertilizer Index, up 270% from the first half of 2020. And the scary thing here, think about this, this is fertilizer. This is how we produce food to feed the world. I read a report a couple weeks ago that said without fertilizer worldwide, we would have half the world population we have today. Fertilizer feeds 3.5 billion people. And so when we see fertilizer shortages, that should terrify all of us. Hopefully these prices are going up fast enough that we can boost production quickly. And we need it by spring here in the Northern Hemisphere. The challenge is Brazil starts planting corn in the next 30 days. So Brazil will be doing their big safrinha corn plant here January, February, and that's when we need fertilizer. Some of those guys in the Southern Hemisphere are saying we can't get fertilizer. I know farmers here in Idaho that said we cannot secure fertilizer, we can't guarantee it unless we take delivery right now. And with liquid fertilizer, that's kind of hard to do. And so, yeah, keep an eye on fertilizer. It will become very critical as we move into our spring planting season. Climate change, the war on livestock. Take a look at this. This is US greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 was 80%. And for the last 20 years, it's all been about CO2, carbon. We've got to reduce carbon emissions. Oh, in the last 2 years, the rhetoric has shifted. And now it's all about methane. And they're saying, well, methane's what we really need to go after. Now, I don't know if there's a political bias to that or not, but if you go after methane, look what you're going to go after. Livestock and manure management, natural gas, petroleum, fossil fuels. Those are all in the crosshairs now. Now, fortunately, we're getting better and better data on livestock emissions, and the data isn't necessarily what it showed back in 2006 when that Livestock's Long Shadow report came out that branded livestock as the cause of global warming, one of the leading causes. And the data we've shown now is much, much more friendly than what we thought. But we definitely need more work on that. We're going to be coming under attack. Just last week, the USDA approved a low carbon beef label that you can apply for and market beef as low carbon. And so we're going to see more of that kind of stuff in the market. One last other risk. What about this? The Russian troop buildup on the Ukraine border. 175,000 troops and equipment have moved to the Ukraine border. I have followed this closely. I followed all of this through my work in the global markets, even since the first annexation of Crimea years ago. But what's different today? The timing is perfect for Mr. Putin. EU and UK energy shortages have driven them begging Russia for natural gas. Electricity prices in the UK are up 500% from what they were a year ago. They're having major, serious energy shortages in the UK and across the EU, and the only answer for them is Russian natural gas. And now that pipeline gets pulled into the politics. So you've got a point where Russia is sitting there going, okay, if I do want to go and take the Ukraine, which has been Vladimir Putin's goal for years. He talked about it in a 60 Minutes interview years ago. He wants it back. Right now, can Europe afford to oppose him? And will the US go it alone without European support? Doubtful. And so I think there's real risk as we look into 2022 that something may happen. And it may happen without a bullet being fired. You know, there's a huge enclave of Russians in eastern Ukraine that are pro-Russian. We'll see where this goes. President Biden hasn't been real clear, but he said, hey, we're committed to the Ukraine sovereignty. At the same time, he tells Putin there will be consequences if you go in. Here's why this is important to us. The Ukraine is the #4 global corn exporter, and they're also the #4 global wheat exporter. And so watch the grains markets in relation to this story. Global demand, I'll just wrap it up with this. And global demand is pretty staggering. When you look at how quickly incomes and population are growing worldwide, the demand for food is going through the roof. It's really incredible. This is just a simple scatter plot here of global meat and poultry consumption against global GDP. 49 years of data. It's a 0.99 R-square. You tell me what GDP is, I'll tell you how much meat and poultry we're going to need in the world. And those yellow dots are the 10-year GDP forecast. So we get a GDP forecast from the IMF and World Bank. I plug that in, and here's what it tells me. By 2030, we're going to have 37 billion more GDP. That's going to generate demand for 78 million tons more meat and poultry. 37% increase. So we're going to need 37% more meat and poultry in 10 years. The last 10 years, we grew by about 55 million tons. We're going to need 78. Now, here's the story for global agriculture. The way we feed 9 billion people is with productivity. It all comes down to productivity. We're going to have less acreage. We've got to feed more people with less acreage. The shortages are real, and so productivity is what gets us there. Take a look at this. The blue bar is the FAO. The United Nations puts out a 10-year production forecast. They said in 10 years, we're going to have 4 million tons more beef, 14 million tons more pork, 23 million tons more poultry. I just used that GDP model and said, based on a 49-year model that's 99% accurate, how much are we going to need the next 10 years based on GDP forecasts? Well, we're going to need 23 million tons more pork. We're going to need 40 million tons more poultry. Do you see what I'm saying here? There is an impending massive shortfall potentially over the next 10 years. I don't know how that gets filled, but I know the only chance is with productivity. Now, this is good for producers. This tells us demand is going to outstrip supply and keep prices high for producers. High prices are going to allow us to invest in productivity. High prices fix high prices. We better hope so, because we all need food 3 times a day. And so that's the path we're on. I think we're going to see a massive investment towards productivity across all agriculture over the next 10 years. And I'll just leave you with this slide. I think out of all the millions and millions of Excel slides I built, this one's the most interesting. World population over 7,000 years. By the year 1800, we had not yet hit 1 billion people. We're at 7.5 today, and we're going to 9 very quickly. We may need more food in the next 150 years than was consumed in the last 7,000 years. That is shocking. And this is really a chart about agriculture more than a chart about people. Food is the necessity. It's a necessary item. Everyone needs it. And so I think it's a fantastic time to be involved in agriculture. I know 2022 is going to have an element of volatility, no doubt about it. But I think the opportunities are fantastic. I would say to any producer out there is gear up for growth. Your plan better have a plan on how you're going to grow. And the only real way to do it is through productivity. With that, I'll wind it up.
All right, thank you very much, Brett. Before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
Every expectant mother knows that what she eats impacts her baby. And now research shows that is also true for our cows. Maternal consumption of ReaShure during late gestation had a positive effect on the in utero calf, setting her up for better health and potentially even higher milk production once she joins the milking string. Learn more at balchemanh.com/launch and launch your herd for life.
All right, as a reminder, you can still submit questions on the questions pane in the control panel. Brett, boy, your presentation brings up a lot of questions. I have a lot of them myself. You know, some of the last information you shared there caused me to wonder what is the and the need for all this additional food. What's the planet's holding capacity? You know, how many people can we feed sustainably?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I show that chart, and that's the initial thought, right? Some people look at that population chart and their response is, we're all going to die. Right? We can't do this. Now, every time I show that chart, I should footnote it with this. I worked on a project a few years ago, And that was our goal, was to say, can we feed 9 billion people by 2050? And we did it under different scenarios. We froze acreage. We froze productivity. We tried different things and said, how can we get there? And what was amazing to me is it will be easy to feed 9 billion people. It's absolutely amazing how much productivity we have left to gain. Now, in the US, we're very productive, but in countries like Brazil and India and China, they're terribly productive. It's very low productivity. You can look at it from a dairy standpoint. The US and Europe have the vast, or produce the vast majority of global milk with a very small cow herd. But if you had Brazil and India's cow herd and China's, it's massive and they produce very little milk. And so if we were just simply spread our productivity over those cows in the third world, we would bury the world in milk. And it's the same with crops, and it's the same with meat. We absolutely have the capacity to feed 9 billion people, far more than 9 billion people, just with existing technology. The challenge is, the one thing we could not do, we could not freeze productivity. We'll never make it if we freeze productivity. But we can shrink acreage. We did it with 13% less acres. We still could feed 9 billion people. And so, yeah, absolutely, we have plenty of capacity on this planet to make food and produce. We just need to be able to spread productivity throughout the world.
Very well. So you were talking a little bit about how much each of the species were going to have to grow to meet the global demand, and you didn't have aquaculture on there. Just kind of curious what role aquaculture will play in meeting the global demand for animal protein.
Yeah, great question, and I get that a lot. So aquaculture is a big piece. It's one of the most consumed proteins in the world. The challenge with talking about aquaculture, and you have to think about this, is there is very, very little data. Now, we can say how much beef is produced and eaten in the world. If we look at aquaculture, look at a country like Indonesia. It's thousands of islands. People live on these islands, even the coasts of Africa. Fishermen go out and fish every day. They sell it into the markets and eat it every day. It's never counted. We have no even reliable estimates on wild-caught seafood. And so we have aquaculture, which is farm seafood. We've got a little better data on, but the wild-caught, we don't have much. Aquaculture will play a bigger role. Now, those are two different stories there. Wild catch is finite, right? You can only fish the ocean so hard. And we're probably seeing overfishing, especially around Asia and even to Africa. Chinese fishing vessels are surrounding Africa right now. They're overfishing around Africa to where the locals are seeing their fish counts go way down in Africa. It's really tough on the locals because of that Chinese demand. They've got vessels all over the world fishing right now. And so that's a finite supply. Aquaculture, we can grow a lot of aquaculture, and we are. The growth in aquaculture is, it looks not quite like the population chart, but it's going up. And the biggest growth in aquaculture is in China. 80% or more of the growth in aquaculture in the last 10 years has been in China. They are building fish farms faster than anyone on earth. But we're also seeing it develop in somewhat in America, but even in Latin America. We're seeing more fish farms going in Ecuador, in Colombia, in the Central American countries. And aquaculture plays a role in that as well, absolutely.
So a related question coming in from Stuart, and I'm not sure where Stuart's from. I'm going to guess he's probably from Europe somewhere, but he's wanting to know the outlook in lamb and mutton production in the coming 10 years. So where do you see that going?
Yeah, so I haven't run that model for lamb and mutton, but I should. My colleague, Simon Quilty, he works with me, and he's out of Australia, and we talk a lot about lamb and sheep meat. Simon's comment, if he were here today, he would say lamb is the new Wagyu. He's been saying that all year, is lamb is the new designer meat, and the prices are astronomical. We're seeing lamb prices go up in ways that no one, I don't think, predicted. And so the demand for lamb is growing. We're going to see production grow. We've just had 2 years of incredible rainfall in Australia, so they're restocking aggressively. The thing that's different with lambs and cattle, remember, lambs typically come in twins. Cattle don't. And so we can increase the global lamb supply quickly, twice as fast as we can increase the global cattle supply. And the demand is phenomenal. and it's all over. We just saw that the US granted approval now to import lamb from the UK, from Europe. We had this old ban. It was probably 15 years. I think it went back to BSE and a disease called scabies, which is a prion disease similar to BSE. And we've got the science, we've had the science for years to say that's not an issue. So now we've now opened the US market to lamb from Europe and from the UK. And that's good news for them. I think the estimate was we're going to be buying as much as 40, 50 million a year in lamb from the UK and Europe. And so I think the lamb outlook is very good. The global beef supplies are very tight, and global beef demand is phenomenal. And it's not just the US. China is now the biggest beef importer in the world. They bought $10 billion of beef last year. They'll buy more this year, and they'll buy more next year. And so as that beef market is tight, beef prices are high, that provides really good cover for lamb prices to be high as well. So I think the outlook for lamb is very good.
Thank you, Stuart, for that question. Stuart's not from Europe. He's actually from South America, or South Africa, sorry. So thank you for that question, Stuart. Mike would like to know, staying kind of with the species theme here, how does dairy benefit from this current and building demand?
Yeah, and dairy it's a heartache story. It's kind of tough because I can look at all these US commodities in 2021, hogs up 40%, cattle up 30%, the prices, and dairy has just floundered. And I showed you that inflation chart. I didn't mention the very bottom commodity on the chart was cheese, which is actually negative from a year and a half ago. Dairy has been the commodity left behind in this commodity boom. However, go take a look at your class 3 milk futures. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen milk light up. Dairy has lit up. And it's good to see because I know what's happening with all the costs. And I've got a lot of friends in the dairy industry, and we do a lot of work in the dairy industry. And so I think 2022 could look very good for dairy. I look at the output. If you look at output of dairy in the UK or in Europe in general, the US, China, I don't know what's going on in India. We don't have very good dairy data out of India. But I think what we're seeing is because of this weak inflation or weak dairy price and heavy inflation, I think we're going to see reduced output. And reduced output is fantastic news for the dairy sector. I think 2022 dairy is going to look much better than a lot of the other commodities. I think we're going to see some good lift into 2022 based on a global tightening of supplies.
All right, thank you. You talked a little bit about the potential impact of Russia invading the Ukraine. What about the impact of China and Taiwan?
Yeah, good question. And that's, boy, that's one nobody knows, right? China has been insistent that Taiwan will be reunified with China, and Taiwan is part of China. And it's almost like this just little sticking point that comes up time to time and people worry about and talk about. I don't know. My opinion is that China has a lot more to lose than they do to gain by making a military move on Taiwan. I think China will continue to, in non-military ways, try to keep progress happening there. But there are a lot of reasons for China not to make a military move on Taiwan, and the US is one of them. It depends on President Xi where he's at. I don't know. I think it would be foolish for him. I don't think it would be good in the long-term interests of China to make that move. And I think it'll continue. I think it'll always be there. It's like North Korea, one of those things we always talk about, flares up a little bit once in a while, but I don't think it's in their best interest to do it. And I think it just continues to be a back burner issue, China and Taiwan.
All right, the next question comes from one of our longtime listeners, Fernando, and he's made the observation that many saving bank accounts from Mexicans in the U.S. have been requested to cancel those accounts. Do you know anything about that?
No, I haven't heard anything about that. So those are foreign accounts. Those are accounts that foreigners hold in the U.S.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought so as well. You said interest rates will likely go up and eventually money will run out. What can we do as consumers and producers in the next year or two to prepare for whatever may come?
It's a good question. It is a good question. So when I say interest rates may go up, I don't think they'll go up to the point of the punitive nature they were in the 80s. I don't think we're going to see 10% inflation, and I doubt we'll see 6% inflation, but we may see 4% or 5%. We may see that, and I'm talking federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is nil right now. I think it'll be slow to go up, and the money will sit out there. Right now, there is just, there are mountains of money sitting on the sidelines of the stock market, sitting out there. The reason is there's no returns. If you are in a cash flush position, how do you make a return on that money? Well, you can go invest it in record high real estate. Doesn't sound like a great idea. You can go invest it in a record high stock market. Not a great idea. The bank rates are zero, no return there. And so what it does, it forces money out into the risky corners of the market. Bitcoin, those kind of things. You know, you start buying stuff saying, I don't even know if this stuff's real, but I think it might be worth more a year from now than it is today. Then you put some money in there. And so this big wave of money that's sitting out there, it's waiting to buy any dip. And so when we look at the stock market, you watch and see if we have a dip in the stock market, it won't last long. It'll be filled because there's all this money waiting to buy every dip they can to get money into the market at a good spot. And so how does the money run out? It takes a long time. It takes, especially for banks and corporations and big entities and the wealthy, it'll take a long time for the money to run out. Now, what about the middle class and the lower middle class and the poor? That money runs out faster, and they're the ones that bear the brunt. I mean, food inflation is really a tax on the poor, is what it is, because they're the ones that feel that the most. They're living on the narrowest margin. And so I think as we see how the money runs out, it'll come from the poor first. And I think that consumer confidence index showed that. We'll see the low income brackets will struggle, and that will be the beginning, and then it'll have to work its way up into the middle class. Now, the US typically is governed by the middle class. And so until the middle class really starts to feel, hey, there's pressure on my pocketbook, I need to pull back, I don't think we see the economy really start to slow down. So for 2022, I don't think that happens in the first 6 months. We'll see. Maybe by the end of next year, we start to see consumers starting to pull back a little bit. And I don't think we'll see interest rates get real aggressive. Now, I don't know. I have no idea what the Fed will do because they've been telling one story for so long and they just kind of changed flags on us here this month. If they want to get aggressive, they should cut those bond purchases immediately and start with small incremental interest rate hikes to try to cool down this market. If they get aggressive here, we might see a 2 basis point increase by the middle of next year. I don't think that's a wreck, but I think that definitely takes some of the craziness out of the markets.
All right, nice answer. You've talked a lot about China driving the market because they're importing and consuming. I guess the way that they could mitigate that is if they were able to produce more internally. Can you talk a little bit about their ability now and in the future to be able to be self-sustaining when it comes to food production? You see this large land mass, you see lots of laborers, and yet they're still huge net importers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I've been traveling to China for going on 20 years now. And from an agriculture standpoint, so not just to the cities, I've been traipsing around farms and I've got to see west, south, north, all over China in the farm country, and it's fascinating. And I always come home with more questions than answers when I go to China. Their big dilemma is simple. It is acres. And years ago, they put a red line and they said, here's a line that we will not cross. We have to have this many agriculture acres. Well, they've crossed that red line years ago, but they're fighting it very hard. They're trying to hold that line on acreage. The problem for China, as I mentioned before, it isn't the population growth. Now, they do have 1.4 billion people. They're nearly 4 times the US population. The challenge is you've got 600-700 million peasant farmers that are moving into the middle class very quickly. And so consumption is the problem. It isn't, it isn't that big population. It's just the rising money. And so as that happens, all of a sudden these people want a cell phone, they want a refrigerator, they want to buy their groceries in a store. And this wave crosses China. Now you look at the scale of China and the shape and the size of the country, you got to realize the vast majority of that country is desert, high altitude, unsuitable for crops. Virtually all of China's crop production is grown up in the northeast corner and right down the eastern seaboard. But it's very mountainous, it's very humid. I see corn grown all over. I can go down and see corn grown in Guangxi province down by the Vietnam border, but that's a very humid climate. And the problem for China is drying corn. Most people don't realize that, but they can produce corn. You got to get it dry so you can store it. And they have had a lot of corn problems with mycotoxins, with putting up corn that's too high moisture. And so they dry it in the streets, they dry it on the roofs of their cement houses. There's corn all over the country trying to be dried out. You go through this last fall, they had a lot of rain. It was really tough. I think they've got some serious quality problems in their corn crop this year. So the question, Scott, is how did they feed themselves, or how did they grow self-sufficiency? The incredible thing is up until now, they've been virtually self-sufficient. They've been able to pretty much survive on what they produce. They have some tough decisions to make in the future. And I think what we'll see is something similar to soybeans. Back in the 1990s, they made a strategic decision and they said, you know what, we can buy soybeans from the US and Brazil. There's two suppliers. We're not totally dependent on one country. We can buy it from multiple sources. Let's move towards importing soybeans so we can use that land to grow corn and wheat and rice and other things that we need. And so that was a big strategic decision. China imports the vast majority of their soybeans now. They don't produce that many. I think they're up against another major decision right now. And my guess is it's probably going to be corn, because now they're looking saying, okay, what do we do next? You don't want to give up a strategic food item like pork. It would make a lot of sense for them to say, let's just import our pork. It's produced cheaper overseas. They don't want to do that. Or rice. We want to produce our own rice. We want to produce our own pork. They really want to produce their own corn, but the decision's a tough one, because I think they look and say, okay, it's not just the US now. We can buy corn from the Ukraine. We can buy corn from Brazil, from Argentina. There's multiple suppliers, and we are out of land. We just simply can't produce what we need. So if we start to import more corn, that'll free up land for other crops like wheat or rice, some of those strategic food items. And so they have some tough decisions to make. I'm guessing it'll be corn, just because they jumped from 3 million tons a year to 26 million last year, and it worked out. And they've learned, hey, we can import corn. But the reality is they simply do not have enough land to pursue a long-term self-sustainability program, like Japan. Japan, of course, is an island, and it's much smaller. Japan imports over 50% of their caloric intake. More than 50% of their food is imported. And if you want to lose leverage on any global negotiation, import your oil and your food, which Japan does, but they just didn't have a choice, right? To become the economy they became, they knew they had to become dependent on imports of energy and food. China hates the idea of that. They will fight it as long as they can. The reality is China is going to be a bigger agriculture importer going forward for years to come.
Interesting. Brett, I see we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to end it with one more question. This one comes in from BJ. If you're an ag CEO, how do you position your company for the future, and what products or services look to be attractive going forward?
Good question. So yeah, if you're an agribusiness CEO, if you're in production, processing, whatever it is, I think one thing you have to realize is volatility is increasing. And I don't care, you can say it's climate change, you can say it's instability. The inflationary world we're in lends itself to more volatility. What that means is you're going to have to spend more money on insurance premiums, whether it's hedging, those kind of things. Look and say, how do I reduce risk? And I can live with some risk, but there are risks I can't have something break us. What can you do to protect against this volatility? And it's probably different for every business. But I tell hog farmers, if you don't have a risk management plan, you should talk to a good broker. You should probably own some puts to protect against potential African swine fever outbreak in the US or whatever it is. But I think it lends itself, today's environment lends itself to say, I'm going to have to spend a little bit on premiums here to put some walls around us that make sure we don't have a major wreck. That's the defensive position. The offensive position is, okay, how do we grow? What are our constraints to growth, and how do we grow smartly? You don't want to grow in a way that requires more labor, for example. How do I grow in a way that doesn't require more labor? How do I increase productivity? How do I secure materials? Am I importing a lot of a necessary item from China? We've learned that's risky. How do I find other sources for those materials? I just think it's a time to really take a hard look and, one, build a defensive fence around yourself, but two, build an aggressive growth strategy based on sustainable patterns. And like I say, avoid labor. Try to say, how do I reduce labor risk? I think those are somewhat obvious, but I would just say the inflation's not going away. And that's tough on the buy side, it's good on the sell side.
All right, thank you, Brett. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science lecture series of webinars continues in the new year with timely topics for the ruminant, monogastric, and companion animal audiences. Our next webinar will feature Dr. Gavin Staley discussing why heifer maturity matters, and that'll be on January 4th. Visit balchem.com/realscience for more details and to register. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Don't forget the full series of podcasts supporting the NRC series are now available through your favorite podcast platform or by visiting balchem.com/podcast. Subscribe to the Real Science Exchange so you don't miss an episode, and be sure to request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt. Learn how at balchem.com/podcast. On behalf of Balchem and Mr. Stuart, thank you for joining us today.